In the heart of the Imperial Ottoman palace, beneath the shimmering domes of Topkapi, lived women whose names were wrapped in gold and silence. They were the daughters of sultans, symbols of royal pride, and yet prisoners of political destiny. Behind their ornate veils and jewels, Ottoman princesses carried a fear rarely spoken of, the fear of marriage, the fear of being given away not to a partner of love, but to a stranger of politics. This is the story of their silent fear. From their birth, Ottoman princesses were raised not as ordinary girls, but as future pawns of the empire's diplomacy. A princess's laughter was heard only within marble walls, her education shaped by tutors, her companions carefully chosen eunuchs and governesses. The harem was both paradise and prison, a place of beauty, fragrance, and learning, but also isolation and control. A princess learned the Quran, poetry, music, and calligraphy, yet she also learned obedience, composure, and secrecy. The empire's power rested on discipline, and women of the dynasty were expected to embody it. For these royal daughters, marriage was not a matter of choice. It was a tool of statecraft. Every union was a political calculation, a means to secure loyalty from powerful viziers or provincial governors. Often, a young princess would learn of her engagement through whispers, not proposals. The sultan, her father or brother, would decide. She could not refuse. In Ottoman culture, royal blood was sacred. It could not mix with foreign royalty, but it could be used to bind loyal servants of the empire. So, when a sultan wished to honor a man, he would offer his daughter's hand. It was the highest form of reward, but also the heaviest burden. For the princess, the wedding symbolized not happiness, but separation. Once she left the palace, she left behind the world she knew. Her mother, her attendants, her safe enclosure. She would travel to distant provinces, to mansions surrounded by unfamiliar faces. The ceremony might be grand, the dowry enormous, the gifts priceless. But the heart trembled. Every drumbeat of celebration was a reminder of exile. The wedding night was not a symbol of union, but the beginning of a new kind of solitude. The fear was not of love, it was of loss, powerlessness, and the unknown. Take the example of Mihrima Sultan, the beloved daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, and Hurrem Sultan. Her marriage to Rustam Pasha was one of empire and politics. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and educated. Yet, even she was nervous about stepping into a new world where her husband, though powerful, was not of royal blood. Behind the ceremony's splendor, Mihrima was said to have wept quietly in her chambers, torn between loyalty to her father and the weight of her new title as wife. The marriage brought her influence, yes, but also loneliness, a reality that echoed across generations of Ottoman princesses. The Ottoman palace viewed marriage as a transaction between loyalty and control. Princesses were often married off at a young age, sometimes as teenagers, to men much older than them. Their grooms were ambitious officials, eager to elevate their rank through proximity to the royal family. For the princess, it was a frightening transition, from being adored as a royal daughter to living as the wife of a statesman with his own household, servants, and expectations. She could no longer speak freely, act freely, or return home without permission. The fear that gripped them was not merely emotional, it was existential. They were stepping into a world where their identity as a princess could either protect them or consume them. Some princesses resisted quietly. Esma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed III, was known for her sharp wit and independence. Her marriage to Yakup Pasha was arranged, and though outwardly dutiful, she maintained a fierce sense of self. Yet even Esma feared the first night of her marriage, not for reasons of intimacy, but for loss of autonomy. She knew what awaited her, a new household where she would be expected to serve as both wife and symbol of imperial grace, constantly watched, constantly judged. It was a fear rooted in duty and expectation, a fear of becoming an ornament rather than a person. Inside the palace, older women often whispered advice to the young brides. They spoke of patience, of silence, of strength. They reminded them that an Ottoman princess could never show weakness, that her tears must never fall where others could see. On the eve of the wedding, the bride would bathe, dress in layers of silk, and wear jewels that caught the candlelight. Musicians would play, attendants would sing, but her heart would pound in quiet dread. She was leaving her childhood behind, perhaps forever. Not all marriages were unhappy, but almost all were arranged with motives beyond emotion. Some princesses learned to wield their position wisely, turning fear into power. Mihrimah Sultan became a trusted advisor to her father and brother, often influencing matters of state. Adil Sultan, centuries later, used her wealth to sponsor poets and charities, finding purpose beyond marriage. But even these remarkable women remembered that their first night of marriage symbolized a forced passage, a ritual of surrender to expectations older than themselves. The fear of Ottoman princesses was also tied to the mystery of the harem. The word harem in Arabic means sacred, forbidden. It was a space where women were protected but also controlled. Inside, they lived under the eyes of eunuchs and the Valid Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. Their days were measured by ritual, their evenings by quiet conversation and music. Yet the outside world viewed the harem with fascination and rumor. When a princess left it for marriage, it was as though she was crossing a line between myth and reality. The unknown world beyond the palace walls frightened many. The idea of living under a man's household outside imperial protection filled them with anxiety. Letters preserved from some Ottoman princesses, though rare, revealed traces of that fear. In one, a princess writes to her mother about her longing for home, describing sleepless nights and a sense of being lost among strangers. In another, a bride speaks of her confusion about new customs in her husband's province. These were not letters of rebellion, but quiet pleas for understanding. Their fear was not defiance, it was humanity. Beyond individual stories, this fear reflected the broader condition of women in the empire. The Ottoman world was complex. It produced poets, architects, and scholars, yet it also confined women of status to rigid roles. Princesses, ironically, were both the most powerful and the most powerless women in the empire. They had wealth, servants, and influence, but no control over their destinies. Their marriages, ceremonies, and even emotions were dictated by politics. The first night symbolized the empire's demand that they must now serve the state through obedience and lineage. Historians have often romanticized Ottoman princesses, depicting them as exotic, mysterious figures draped in silks. But beneath the legend lies the reality of young women caught in the machinery of empire. Their fear was not weakness, it was a reflection of awareness. They understood what it meant to lose control of one's fate. They understood that behind every celebration was a cost. As the centuries passed, Ottoman princesses began to express their individuality more openly. During the 18th and 19th centuries, some were educated in literature, politics, and art. They began writing poetry, composing music, even influencing reform movements. Yet even then, the shadow of that ancient fear lingered. Every royal marriage carried echoes of duty and sacrifice. Every smile carried the memory of tears once shed in silence. The story of these women is not only about fear, it is about resilience. Their courage lay in endurance. They carried the weight of empire, knowing they would never be free in the way others were. Yet through grace and intellect, many carved space for themselves within the confines of tradition. Their fear became part of their strength, their silence a form of survival. When we look at the gilded portraits of Ottoman princesses today, Mihrimah Sultan in her embroidered kaftan, Esma Sultan gazing through latticed windows, Adil Sultan with her pen poised above paper, we see more than beauty. We see the quiet strength of women who lived between duty and desire, between privilege and captivity. Their fear of that first night, of being handed over to the unknown, was not just personal. It was symbolic of the larger story of women in power constrained by tradition. The empire eventually faded, its palaces turned into museums, its rituals into memory. But the echo of those silenced hearts still lingers in the marble corridors of Topkapi. Visitors may see the jewels, the carpets, the gilded rooms, but if one listens closely, one might hear the whisper of a girl once afraid to leave her home, unsure of what awaited her beyond the gates. That whisper is the true voice of the Ottoman princess, a voice of fear, courage, and quiet dignity. In the end, the story of Ottoman princesses is not about extravagance or scandal. It is about humanity. It is about young women raised to be symbols of empire, yet yearning to be simply understood. Their fear of the wedding night was not a secret of lust, but a cry of the heart, a plea for compassion in a world that saw them only as instruments of power. Through their silence, they taught the empire itself a lesson, that behind every golden throne there lies a fragile soul, brave enough to love, to fear, and to endure. As the centuries turned and the Ottoman Empire entered its twilight, the world inside the palace began to change. The rigid walls of the harem that once echoed only with whispers of obedience now started carrying faint sounds of poetry, philosophy, and rebellion. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century introduced new ideas of modernization and equality, and even the secluded lives of Ottoman princesses began to reflect those transformations. Yet beneath the reforms, the same silent fear remained, the fear of losing identity, of being remembered as ornaments of an empire rather than as voices of their own story. By the mid-1800s, Ottoman princesses were no longer confined purely to the ornamental role that their foremothers had endured. Education became an accepted, even admired pursuit for royal women. Princesses were taught French, literature, and even the basics of science and politics. Westernization had entered the gates of Topkapi and Dolmabahce palaces, and with it came the idea that women could think, speak, and write for themselves. The empire wanted to appear modern in the eyes of Europe, and royal daughters became its most visible symbols of progress. Yet this progress came with contradiction. The same empire that allowed its princesses to write poetry still arranged their marriages as political gestures. The conflict between intellect and obedience deepened, and the fear of marriage evolved into something more complex, the fear of silence in a world beginning to find its voice. Adile Sultan, daughter of Sultan Mahmud II, is a perfect reflection of this duality. She was deeply spiritual, poetic, and intelligent. She composed verses about love, loss, and divine longing, yet her personal life reflected the same pattern of political marriage. Her union with Mehmet Ali Pasha was arranged to consolidate loyalty among the ruling elite. Adile's writings reveal glimpses of melancholy and wisdom, a mixture of faith and restraint. She wrote of patience, of longing, and of the dignity that comes from enduring destiny rather than resisting it. Through her poetry, she turned fear into art, transforming her inner silence into eternal words. The younger generations of princesses began to see themselves not merely as daughters of sultans, but as witnesses of history. Nazim Sultan, daughter of Sultan Abdulaziz, lived through an era of modernization and turmoil. She saw the empire struggle to maintain its dignity against European powers. Like her predecessors, she was married for political convenience, but she also became a figure of charity and education. She sponsored schools for girls, hosted intellectuals, and even wrote essays. Yet, despite her privileges, Nazime often confided in her letters that royal marriages still carried the same suffocating weight. The palace had changed its decorations, its language, even its architecture, but not the expectations from women of the dynasty. The same fear of the unknown, the same isolation, persisted under a different name, duty. During the late 19th century, Western influence introduced new forms of romantic ideals into Ottoman society. The novels of Europe spoke of love, companionship, and personal choice, dreams that Ottoman princesses could only imagine. Some of them, like Refia Sultan, tried to bridge this cultural gap. Refia Sultan, daughter of Sultan Abdulmajid, grew up surrounded by reformist energy. She was educated in multiple languages and corresponded with European intellectuals. Yet when her marriage was arranged, she too felt the clash between the world she had read about and the one she lived in. Her husband, Mahmud Edhem Pasha, was a prominent statesman, respected but distant. Rafia's writings, preserved in fragments, suggest an emotional restraint, admiration mixed with resignation. The fear of her first night for her symbolized not just uncertainty about her husband, but the collapse of her dream of personal freedom. In these later centuries, the fear that Ottoman princesses felt no longer stemmed from mystery or physical vulnerability, but from emotional suppression. They feared being remembered only as political instruments, despite their learning and wisdom. Their voices were trapped between empire and reform, between Islam and modernity, between East and West. They understood the burden of history, that their names would forever be tied to their fathers and husbands, not to their thoughts and achievements. Yet, quietly, many of them found ways to defy that fate. One such defiance was through writing. Poetry became their language of liberation. Adil Sultan's verses carried mystical beauty. Rafia Sultan's letters displayed intellect. Fatma Sultan's correspondence hinted at defiance. In their own words, they expressed what could not be said aloud. These writings, carefully preserved by palace historians, reveal the psychological strength of women who lived under the weight of silence. They did not rebel openly. They rebelled through grace. The late Ottoman era also brought about the concept of companionate marriage, influenced by European ideals. Some younger princesses hoped for emotional connection rather than political strategy. However, for most of them, the old customs prevailed. Their marriages continued to serve alliances, their dowries remained instruments of diplomacy, and their fears remained unchanged in essence. The fear was no longer only personal, it became generational, a memory passed down from one princess to another, a warning whispered across centuries. When the Ottoman Empire began to crumble after World War I, the fate of these women took another turn. The abolition of the Sultanate and later the Caliphate forced many royal family members into exile. Princesses who once lived among fountains and gold domes suddenly found themselves in modest houses across Europe, living on meager allowances. The fear that once haunted their wedding nights was replaced by a new terror: poverty, displacement, and anonymity. For the first time, they were free from arranged marriages, yet trapped in survival. Many of them looked back on their royal past, not with pride, but with bittersweet nostalgia. The empire that once bound them in silence had at least given them identity. Exile took even that away. Despite these hardships, some princesses showed remarkable resilience. Adil Sultan continued to support education and poetry until her last days. Nazime Sultan remained active in charitable causes during exile. Others quietly lived out their days, fading into history, their stories forgotten except by scholars and archivists. Their fear of that first night, which once represented duty and loss, came to symbolize something larger: the eternal struggle of women to balance expectation and individuality. When historians study the Ottoman Empire today, they often focus on sultans, wars, and reforms. But the emotional history of its women, especially its princesses, tells an equally important story. It reveals how power can coexist with vulnerability, how privilege can conceal pain. These women lived in marble palaces, yet they trembled with human fears. They were symbols of empire, yet they longed for something as simple as understanding. Their lives remind us that history is not only made by battles and decrees. It is also written in tears shed behind closed doors, in letters never sent, in fears never spoken aloud. The Ottoman princesses, for all their grandeur, were bound by the same emotional truths that connect all human beings: the desire to be loved, to be heard, to belong. Even now, centuries later, the memory of their fear remains hauntingly beautiful. It tells us that the most powerful empires are not defined only by their conquests, but by the hearts that quietly endured within them. The silent fear of Ottoman princesses was not a weakness. It was a mirror reflecting the empire's soul, magnificent, fragile, and deeply human. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the early 20th century, the world that had defined the lives of its princesses vanished almost overnight. The palaces that once glowed with music, incense, and whispers of statecraft were emptied by decree. The year 1924 brought exile, a word that echoed like a death sentence through the royal family. Overnight, the women who had been symbols of majesty became wanderers in foreign lands. For the Ottoman princesses, exile was a second wedding night, a night of fear, but this time without ceremony or silk, without the illusion of choice or control. They were forced to marry the unknown again, not to a man, but to destiny itself. When they left Istanbul, many princesses carried only a few jewels, family photographs, and memories of the empire that had raised them. They left behind the Bosphorus, the mosques, the call to prayer echoing from their childhood balconies. Trains took them to Europe and the Middle East. Paris, Beirut, Cairo, and Rome became their new homes. Yet none of these cities could replace the fragrance of tulips in the palace gardens or the warmth of Istanbul's sun on marble courtyards. The fear they had once felt before their first marriage now returned in another form, the fear of being forgotten. In exile, their titles meant little. To Western society, they were relics of a fallen dynasty. To modern Turkey, they were reminders of a past the Republic wished to move beyond. Many of them lived in modest apartments, sewing to survive or giving music lessons to foreign children. Their names, once announced with royal flourish, were now written quietly on rented doors, yet they carried their dignity like an invisible crown. The fear that had once silenced them became a source of reflection. They had faced exile, loneliness, and loss, and yet they endured. One of the most poignant stories is that of Princess Fehime Sultan, daughter of Sultan Murad V. Known for her intelligence and artistic grace, Fehime was forced into exile along with her family. She had once lived surrounded by servants and tutors. Now she wrote letters by candlelight in Paris, describing the pain of displacement. Her words were filled not with bitterness, but with a strange serenity, a tone of acceptance, as if she had finally made peace with the destiny that had haunted generations of Ottoman princesses. "We were born behind golden bars," she wrote in one of her private notes, "and now we live without walls, but the wind is cold." For many princesses, exile became a mirror reflecting their inner strength. They no longer feared the ceremonies of empire or the commands of politics. Their new struggle was survival. But survival gave them something their ancestors had rarely known: freedom. Without the weight of the palace or the shadow of arranged marriages, some began to express themselves more openly. A few wrote memoirs, while others shared their experiences with journalists and historians. For the first time, their voices reached beyond the palace gates. Their fear had evolved into wisdom, their silence into testimony. The 20th century also brought new recognition. Scholars, writers, and filmmakers began to explore the personal lives of Ottoman women, not as curiosities of empire, but as individuals shaped by history. The myth of the silent princess began to fade. Instead, the world discovered the depth of their resilience, the poetry of their endurance. Their fears were not forgotten, they became lessons. In modern Turkey, as palaces turned into museums and archives opened, people began to see these women differently. Their stories became symbols of transition, from empire to republic, from silence to self-expression. Visitors walking through the halls of Dolmabahce Palace today often stop by the portraits of the princesses, faces framed in pearls and lace, eyes deep with unspoken words. Some portraits show faint smiles, others a haunting calm. Each one tells a story of a woman who learned to live between two worlds. The modern Turkish woman owes part of her journey to these royal ancestors. Though the Ottoman princesses were bound by strict customs, their endurance paved the way for future generations to imagine a different destiny. Their fear was not wasted. It was transformed into memory, into quiet courage. The strength they showed in exile, the grace they carried despite loss, became part of Turkey's cultural inheritance. As decades passed, descendants of these princesses found themselves scattered across continents. Some lived in France, some in Lebanon, others in Egypt or the United States. Their children and grandchildren spoke different languages, but carried fragments of Ottoman legacy in their stories. Interviews conducted in later years revealed that many of them grew up hearing tales of fear, beauty, and survival from their mothers and grandmothers, tales that blended sadness with pride. The fear of the first wedding night, the fear of leaving the palace, the fear of exile, all became part of a single, timeless narrative, the journey from silence to voice. The fear that had begun centuries earlier under the golden domes of Topkapi ended not in tragedy, but in transformation. It became a bridge between two civilizations, two identities. Ottoman princesses, once bound by imperial law, ended their lives as citizens of the world, still bearing the scars of history, but also its wisdom. Their fear was never merely personal. It was the fear of losing selfhood in the tides of empire, the fear of fading into the background of history. Yet through their letters, poetry, and endurance, they refused to disappear. Today, historians continue to uncover their writings, diaries, and personal artifacts. Each discovery adds a new layer to their legacy. In one diary, a princess writes of standing by a window in exile, watching snow fall and wondering if it touched the palace gardens in the same way. In another, a letter speaks of forgiveness to fathers who arranged their marriages, to husbands who never understood them, and even to history itself. These intimate glimpses remind us that behind every crown lies a heart, and behind every fear lies a story. If we listen closely, the silence of those princesses is not empty. It is full of meaning. It is the silence of understanding, of strength held quietly for centuries. It is the silence of women who bore the empire's burdens, but never let them break their spirit. Theirs was a fear that did not end in surrender. It evolved into remembrance. Imagine, for a moment, the closing scene of this story. The Bosphorus at dusk, seagulls gliding over the dark water, the call to prayer echoing from both sides of the strait. In a small apartment overlooking the same sea she once ruled over, an aged Ottoman princess stands by the window. Her hands are folded, her eyes distant. She remembers the palace, the laughter of her youth, the drums of her wedding, the quiet sob she hid that night. She remembers exile, the long train rides, the faces of strangers who pitied her name. But she also remembers love, kindness, poetry, and the strength that kept her alive through all storms. She smiles faintly, not out of regret, but realization. Her fear has transformed into understanding. The story of the Ottoman princesses is the story of women who lived in the golden cage of power and still found ways to feel, to think, to endure. Their silence was not weakness. It was a different form of expression in a world that feared their voice. Their fear of the unknown, of marriage, of exile, was the fear every human heart carries, the fear of losing oneself. Yet in confronting that fear, they preserved something eternal: dignity. When we walk through the palaces today, we do not just see marble and gold. We see the echo of their footsteps, the faint rustle of silk, the sound of unspoken prayers. We see courage that did not shout, but whispered across centuries. The Ottoman princesses may have lived in fear, but their legacy lives in strength. Their story reminds us that even in silence, one can leave a voice strong enough to outlast empires. And so, as history closes the book on their lives, we open it again. Not to pity them, but to honor them. For in their quiet endurance lies the most human truth of all. That fear does not define us. How we rise beyond it does.